a meeting that changed everything. The historic meeting between Chinese leader Xi Jinping and US President Donald Trump, which took place in South Korea, could completely reshape the balance of geopolitical power on the map. And most importantly, the main topic of these negotiations was ending the war in Ukraine. And interestingly, Xi and Trump reached an agreement between themselves. Moreover, they essentially threw Putin overboard. Trump is hitting Russia with sanctions, and Xi does not recognize the annexation of Crimea or the occupation of Ukrainian territories. Furthermore, he emphasizes that Ukraine is a sovereign and independent country. Well, and what all this will lead to, we will continue to figure out together. Hello, everyone. My name is Anastasiia Husarieva. Today, we're talking about the historic meeting that has already taken place in South Korea. What will it lead to, and will it really help end the war in Ukraine? But before that, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't done so yet. And of course, give this video a like. And now I'll start from the beginning and tell you what the meeting resulted in and what it all means for us. So, US President Donald Trump and the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, held a bilateral meeting in the South Korean city of Busan. This was the first meeting since the start of Donald Trump's second presidential term. The meeting lasted for an hour and 40 minutes. This was longer than what was scheduled in the American leaders' agenda. At the beginning of the meeting, US President Donald Trump stated that he expected very successful negotiations. And after the meeting, in his first comments, Trump said that everything went great. And a separate topic of these negotiations, which have already taken place. Of course, among the topics discussed between US President Donald Trump and Chinese leader Xi Jinping was the war in Ukraine, which the Russian Federation started in 2022. According to Trump, the parties agreed to cooperate in an effort to find ways to end the conflict. The American leader explained that both he and Chinese leader Xi Jinping were in agreement. The situation at the front has now reached a stalemate. Sometimes he said you have to let events take their course, but the Chinese leader assured that he is ready to help. Trump, in turn, emphasized that the US and China will now work together on the issue of Ukraine. He added that both sides will do everything possible to put an end to the war, but for now, according to him, they cannot do more. And already the first tremors from all of this can be seen. The global chessboard is shifting, and the piece labeled Putin has been moved aside. China is the main buyer of Russian oil and gas. And it should be noted, China has sharply changed its course. And now it is looking toward the United States. This was hinted at, and Trump wrote about a very large-scale deal related to oil and gas. He wrote about this on his usual social network, Truth Social. And most likely, this refers to agreements with Chinese leader Xi Jinping and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol. Well, as I mentioned, this meeting actually took place in South Korea. It was about purchasing more American oil and American gas. And for Moscow, this will be a low blow. Because fewer contracts mean fewer dollars, less money for the war. And Beijing acts subtly, it scolds, but makes it clear, we're with you as long as it's beneficial. And if China really cuts off its support, Russia will definitely feel what it's like to wage war without Chinese money. That's a completely different story. And it's worth adding here that China does not recognize the annexation of Ukrainian territories. Specifically, we're talking about the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and the temporary occupation of all the territories that unfortunately are currently under Russian control. This was stated by the ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the European Union, Fu Kong. And it was precisely during the meeting in the spring of 2023 with French President Emmanuel Macron, whom you can see on your screens now, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, that this very statement was made. The diplomat clarified that talk of an unlimited friendship between Moscow and Beijing is more rhetoric than reality. China does not approve of Russian aggression and does not supply weapons to Moscow. At least that's the statement made by the ambassador. Whether you believe it or not is up to you. Back then, 2.5 years ago, European leaders tried to involve China more actively in the peaceful resolution of the war and emphasized that its stance on the conflict would determine future relations. This time, not just with Russia, but between China itself and the member countries of the European Union. I should note that before that meeting, Chinese leader Xi Jinping had visited Moscow back in March and met personally with Putin. However, as was evident from the statements at the time, Beijing kept its distance, maintained dialogue with Russia, but did not associate itself with the war. And here we also need to consider China's position. China officially stated that it remains neutral, but in practice it has become the main supplier of crucial components for Russian combat drones. According to the Wall Street Journal and analysts' investigations, Beijing does not provide direct weaponry, but sells a large number of dual-use components, all of which end up in Russia's military projects. In 2024, Russia reportedly purchased over 3.3 million small engines from the Chinese company Shenzhen Kiosk Electronics. And here you have it. These are dual-use goods. These small electric motors are officially considered suitable for use in household appliances, such as washing machines or water pumps. However, in reality, the Russian army actually uses them to build those very same types of drones that attack our country, our cities, and our people both day and night. And the main recipient is the Moscow company Rostock, which manufactures FPV drones. Its revenue in 2023 increased 12-fold and exceeded 1 billion rubles. The European Union has already imposed sanctions against Rostock. This happened back in December 2024, but unfortunately, this did not stop the purchases. From July 2023 to February 2025, Rostock imported goods from China worth approximately $294 million, including more than $83 million worth of engines. In other words, Rostock operates not only as a manufacturer, but also as a logistics center for other Russian drone assemblers. One more thing, China is doing this less and less. It sells critical components to Ukraine and its partners less and less. And sometimes Chinese engines and other parts are imported into Russia under documents claiming they are for industrial refrigeration units. Or they go through shell companies to bypass those same sanctions and, of course, to cover their tracks. So technically, Beijing isn't supplying tanks or planes, but through the massive export of engines, navigation systems, and electronics, thank you. It is actually actively fueling that same Russian drone electronics, the very manufacturing and production of drones that Russia uses in its war against Ukraine. And here it should also be said that this has become a painful problem for Western sanctions, and that's why, ahead of the meeting, Ukraine and its allies called on Trump to put pressure on Xi Jinping regarding China's support for Russia. Moreover, it is worth noting that this meeting actually took place just 1 week after Washington officially announced sanctions against two of the largest Russian oil companies, namely Rosneft and Lukoil. After that, even Lukoil announced its intention to wind down its international operations and began looking for buyers for its foreign assets. And here, it's worth adding that there was even information that a buyer had been found, an international company registered in Cyprus, and previously, an oligarch from the inner circle was among the company's management. Whether the company will buy out Lukoil's international assets, we'll see, of course. And now, the so-called Friends of Peace from the Global South are calling for a ceasefire in Ukraine. What does this mean? I'll explain now. So, the Friends of Peace is a group of countries that includes China, Brazil, and several other states from the Global South. They are promoting the idea of a peaceful resolution to the Ukrainian crisis. That's what they call the war in Ukraine, and are calling for an end to hostilities. Without identifying which side is at fault, in their statements, Moscow and Kiev appear equally responsible for the war. Recently, this group addressed the UN with a call to stop the fighting in Ukraine. Representatives of the countries stated that it is time for a political settlement and that everyone should come to the negotiating table. It really does sound peaceful, but the statement itself does not contain a single word about who actually started this war. They speak only about the parties to the conflict as if the aggressor and the victim are on the same level, on the same side. And of course, Russia is not called the aggressor there. China and Brazil, who spoke on behalf of the Friends of Peace, insist on avoiding escalation, not expanding the battlefield, and not supplying weapons. In other words, this is a hint at the West, which is helping Ukraine defend itself in this case. The Chinese side also expressed indignation at the unilateral sanctions, which, in their opinion, harm the countries of the Global South. Although they did not specify exactly which sanctions they meant, it is obvious that they are referring to the US restrictions against Russian oil and gas companies. In words, it's all about peace, humanity, and dialogue, but in reality, this position is very close to the Kremlin's. Let's call for a ceasefire without naming anyone. Who attacked, why Ukraine is even forced to fight. And while the Friends of Peace call for peace without victors, Russia continues to systematically shell Ukrainian cities. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that the US and China may sign a trade agreement. According to him, the parties have reached a balance and plan to act in accordance with the agreements over the next 12 months. This breakthrough became possible after negotiations between US President Donald Trump and the President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping, which took place at the end of October. After the meeting, it became known that the US plans to reduce tariffs on imports from China from 57 to 47%, and China agreed to suspend export restrictions on rare earth metals for 1 year. In addition, Beijing committed to purchasing significant volumes of American soybeans, about 12 million metric tons by January, as well as approximately 25 million tons annually over the next 3 years. This agreement signals a significant easing of the trade conflict that we previously observed between the US and China. The resumption of soybean supplies to China. The reduction of tariffs could have a positive effect both for American farmers and for global markets. At the same time, it remains unclear when exactly the agreement will be officially signed and how long it will remain in effect. I should also note that official sources, including Reuters, CB News, and France 24, confirm the key details of these agreements, including tariff reductions, large purchases of soybeans, and a pause in export restrictions on rare earth metals. At the same time, the exact dates for the resumption of supplies and the deadlines for fulfilling all points of the agreement have not yet been disclosed. At the beginning of this autumn, Russia and China agreed on a visa-free regime between the two countries for a period of 1 year. This agreement allows Russians to stay in China for up to 30 days for tourism, business, or visiting relatives or friends. And for the Chinese, this opens a convenient path for gradual resettlement in Siberia and the Far East. According to the Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council, Chinese enclaves with their own schools, businesses, and of course their own culture are already appearing in the country's regions. Locals are often not hired there. Chinese loggers work there, Chinese companies operate, and the money earned goes back to Beijing. The head of the Center for Countering Disinformation, Andriy Kovalenko, says outright that Moscow is essentially allowing foreigners to settle on strategic lands, and is doing so slowly and quietly. And if this continues, by 2030, several 100,000 Chinese could settle in Siberia. Due to the demographic crisis, Russia cannot populate these vast territories on its own, and the vacuum is gradually being filled by others. So, to put it briefly and sum up, visa-free travel with China is not just a tourism measure, it's a mechanism for slow but large-scale infiltration. And for the Kremlin, this may turn out not to be a win, but a challenge. For years, Putin built a world where everyone played by his rules, or so he thought. But now the rules are being rewritten without him. When Xi Jinping and Donald Trump shake hands, it's not just diplomacy, it's a signal that the world is entering a new era. And there is no place for the Kremlin in it. China is buying oil from the US, not from Russia. Europe is strengthening sanctions, and even those whom Putin once called friends are turning away from him. If Xi really decides to put on the pressure, the Russian war might stop not because of negotiations, but because of a lack of fuel and money to continue waging this war. Let's see how events unfold. You give us a like and subscribe, and we'll keep providing information. And we'll see you in the next broadcasts. My name is Anastasiia Husarieva. Take care of yourselves and wash your hands. Best wishes to all.